Hey everybody, this is a piece by Peter Beilharz titled The Young Trotsky. It's from 1991. Who was Trotsky, or rather, what was Trotsky? The images pervade, and what his French admirers appropriately call the iconography. There is Trotsky, in his youthful mugshots, defiant in his cell before the trial of the 1905 Soviet, aboard his military train in the Civil War, airbrushed out of the frames of October, fishing in exile on the Sea of Marmara, feeding his rabbits in Coyoacan, reading his proofs, lying dying, his brain shattered by Stalin's assassin. For each phase there is a persona, dressed in smocking, now besuited with pince-nez, in military garb, now in leather, now in white, alternatively the oppositionist, the quote pen, quote antidoto, man of the people, professional revolutionary, soldier, commissar, finally exile on the planet without a visa, homeless hero and martyr of the revolution. Who then was Trotsky? There are so many images that some might simply deduce that there are too many Trotskys to make sense of. Yet the elements of continuity are also there. An obsession with revolution, an identification of revolution with history or modernity, capital H history or modernity. They explain Trotsky's resistance to the Vanguard Party, which was to dissolve only in 1917 when the Bolsheviks finally became the missing link in the process in which Trotsky's life was submerged. Trotsky forged his Faustian pact with the party and with state power in October, when it became clear that the Russian Revolution could not make itself. The outsider became transformed into the armed prince, Rousseau into Machiavelli, and then into the prophet armed, when capital H history took capital H history's wrong turn, elevating Stalin over Trotsky, leaving Trotsky in Deutscher's memorable phrase as the last remaining revolutionary from the lost Atlantis of the October Revolution. In the annals of intellectual Trotskyism, it is the heroic image which pervades. Trotsky is presented, for example, by Perry Anderson as the premier historian of Marxism, while Norman Garris prides Trotsky as the creator of a literature of revolution. Followers such as Ernest Mandel celebrate Trotsky as the foremost critic of fascism, while critics such as George Marcus draw attention to his status as the primary founding analyst of the Soviet Union in The Revolution Betrayed. Well, George Marcus's purpose is to advance upon the level of understanding of Trotsky. However, these other writers come in praise, as do his more recent biographers, Cliff and Bruet, still endeavoring unsuccessfully to supplant the work of Deutscher. Viewed in a different light, Trotsky's intellectual achievement lies elsewhere. Three submerged moments in Trotsky's thought are suggestive of this. One is the brilliant, if deeply flawed, scenario of hypermodernism sketched out in Literature and Revolution, where Trotsky dares to dream and to expect a radical and perpetual transformation of all that is social or human. Another is the ruminations in the recently published philosophical notebooks of 1933 to 35, where Trotsky's evolutionary thinking takes on more subtlety when it is explained as bearing a catastrophic architectonic, as contrasted to the systemic orientation of, say, Bukharin. The notebooks certainly make fascinating reading, alongside the 1935 diary, though it is tempting to align them on the whole with Lenin's philosophical notebooks rather than with Gramsci's prison notebooks. The other source of insight is that of Trotsky's early work, before Bolshevism, before absolutism, before the revolution. The purpose of this paper is to establish and further examine the content of Trotsky's early work, which is barely recognized as an intellectual and political achievement, alongside that of the history of the Russian Revolution or the Revolution Betrayed, and this essentially because of its essential anti-Bolshevism. Footnote, see earlier Beilharz, 1981b. One indicator of the marginal status of early Trotsky's work is that it is thinly theorized, even in the wide-ranging collection of essays in Gory, 1982. That was a footnote and end footnote. New section, Rebel Without a Cause. The young Trotsky could not have anticipated all these problems of interpretation, for though Trotsky lived for revolution, Trotsky did not yet live only for October. Trotsky was born Bronstein on the day which was to become that of the October Revolution, the 26th of October, 1879. Trotsky's rural boyhood became as distant to Trotsky as was feudalism itself from his Americanist conception of modernity. The rupture opened when the boy, aged 9, went to live in Odessa. Here lay the founding elements of his cosmopolitanism: the theater, the opera, the smell of printer's ink, the petty injustices of school life, which so impressed that Trotsky was in consequence frequently to call on images of the classroom in the writings of his later life. For the young Trotsky, the classroom, like the country, was gray to the green of life and the vibrance of the city. Odessa struck Trotsky so profoundly that Trotsky first encountered Paris as a larger Odessa and preferred Odessa. Here Trotsky met the work of Dickens, of Goethe, of Shakespeare. Trotsky read more of Tolstoy and of Pushkin and started a magazine, upsetting the authorities and alienating his family, but he was, so far, a rebel without a cause. Trotsky was not always a Marxist. Marxism was not yet part of Trotsky's world, and Trotsky's first encounter with Marxism were unequivocally negative. Trotsky's sense of social injustice led rather to that idiosyncratic posture of rebellion characteristic of adolescence. Marxism was for Trotsky an intellectual prison. Trotsky did not want to be bound by a worldview which, as Trotsky declaimed, sought only to bring dryness and hardness into all the relations of life. Trotsky read rather Mill and Bentham and Chernyshevsky. Trotsky now left the cultural warmth of his lodgings in order to live a Spartan communal existence with other young rebels and the radical gardener Shvigovsky. 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 Together, like later generations, they ran an informal university where Trotsky's brief was to lecture in sociology and to write plays, authoring their own propaganda. Such apparently harmless activity was not so innocent in the eyes of the Tsarist authorities. The young Trotsky thus began a long relationship with the Tsar's prisons. Eventually, Trotsky served time in almost 20 such institutions where, again like generations, Trotsky acquired a political education. Finally, he met the work of Marx and Lenin and Labriola, and soon Trotsky was to take a fake passport with a new name and what was to become a historic aura, Trotsky. The Marxism which beckoned Trotsky was that of the Second International, exemplified in the culture of the German Social Democratic Party. In prison, Trotsky began to embrace the Marxist worldview. In his book, My Life, Trotsky relates that even as a schoolboy, Trotsky had been attracted to the general over the particular, law over fact, theory over personal experience, the romance of Odessa over the dull tedium of the Ukrainian steppes. In prison, Trotsky grappled further with these issues. Where did ideas come from? Was history a process characterized by the combination of differing logics, or was there some factor which was privileged? Did not economic life govern the direction of history? Confronted by these quandaries, Trotsky embraced historical materialism. Uncertainty repelled Trotsky. Trotsky would later describe it as the consequence of petty bourgeois vacillation and nervelessness. Trotsky thus read Labriola's Essays on the Materialist Conception of History, a treatise defending contingency against inevitability, as a verification of his own view that material forces, primarily those in economic life, provided the master key to explaining and making universal history. During the same period of confinement, however, Trotsky also began to address the problem of contradiction or uneven development in history. In prison, Trotsky began a major study of Freemasonry, discovering, among other things, the differences between its national forms. Sometimes Masonry was reactionary, sometimes progressive, even revolutionary. Particular experiences did in fact undermine the generalities to which Trotsky was attracted. Further, the upshot of Trotsky's study of Masonry was that the past would dominate the present. Ideology and culture did possess a formative power after all. But if this was so, ruptural social change could never achieve the social transparency to which revolutionaries aspire. The implication was closer to Freud than to Marx, suggesting as it did that consciousness could not consciously be changed. Trotsky's prison notebooks were lost, but the tension established in Trotsky's prison notebooks was to remain a major motif in Trotsky's understanding of history. The particular continued to struggle with the general, fact with law, experience with theory, history with historical materialism. New section, the cause. Plainly, Marxism fulfilled a need for the young Trotsky. Trotsky resisted Marxism only so long as Trotsky could, for Trotsky needed an instrument to turn against Russian populism and upon anarchism. The sharp knife of Marxism offered defense against Russian capitalism and offense upon its Russian capitalism's looser opponents. Trotsky encountered Marxism further via Lenin's Development of Capitalism in Russia and in the first volume of Marx's Capital. Trotsky shared Lenin's sense that the process of capitalist development was well underway in Russia, and yet that it directly affected only a minority of the people. He read the Bernstein-Kautsky debate over reform and revolution and can only have been obliged to support Kautsky, for Bernstein proposed not only to eschew revolutionary politics but also to plug the Marxist canon. In other debates, his views were less orthodox. Like many, Lenin aside, Trotsky read and admired the God-builder and relativist Bogdanov, who only later was to be cast as a Marxist eccentric. Having escaped exile in Western Europe, he imbibed there its extraordinary political and intellectual culture. Henceforth his lifelong cause was to be that of Marxism. Yet Trotsky was no Bolshevik. Indeed, Trotsky was Lenin's most vehement critic. Notwithstanding Trotsky's later political identification with Bolshevism or Trotsky's personal obsession with Lenin, Trotsky entered the 20th century arms linked with social democrats like Axelrod and Martov, mind attuned with socialist revolutionaries such as Gramsci and Luxemburg. Trotsky's cause was that of Marxism, but Trotsky's vocation was not that of the professional revolutionary. Trotsky's belief was that the masses themselves carried the impulse to socialism. Trotsky had nothing but scorn for the notion shared by Kautsky and Lenin that left to itself, the working class could only ever generate trade union consciousness of economic grievances. Where am I? Sorry, I lost my spot. Trotsky's intuitive sense of the nature of history was closer to that of syndicalism. Trotsky agreed with Parvus that the general strike itself was sufficient to place the democratic workers' government in power. Trotsky's contempt for Lenin and Jacobinism was sufficient to warrant the major early work, Our Political Tasks of 1904, which, significantly, was repressed in English for 80 years. Here Trotsky launched an attack on Bolshevism rather like that later to be turned on him by democratic socialists. Together with his reflection on the 1905 revolution and his early formulations of the theory of permanent revolution, Our Political Tasks provides leading clues to the nature of Trotsky's early Marxism. For if Trotsky was not always a Marxist, neither was he a lifelong Bolshevik. Once when Lenin had chastised Luxemburg for not, quote, speaking Russian, end quote, with sufficient fluency, Trotsky had retorted in her defense that she did speak an excellent Marxian. Such was his own inflection in Our Political Tasks. Dedicated to the Menshevik Axelrod, Trotsky employed his missile not only against Lenin, but also to defend his newfound cause, the self-emancipation of the working class. Trotsky's case was authentically Marxian, and was thus both rhetorical rather than logically persuasive in tenor, and morally naive rather than Jacobin in its ethical orientation. Like Marx, the young Trotsky believed socialist revolution to be built into the order of things. Both believed the working class to be revolutionary by disposition. Both consequently viewed the party as of secondary rather than primary significance in the revolutionary process. The difference which was to emerge historically between Marx and the later Trotsky was that Trotsky's pact with capital H history led Trotsky finally to accept the idea of socialism at any cost. Marx, by comparison, put his hopes in history alone and never ceased to believe that socialism could only be the task of the workers to whom Marx imputed this responsibility. The philosophy of history in Our Political Tasks thus vitally anticipates Trotsky's conversion to Bolshevism in 1917. Rather than providing an enigmatic reversal or adding just another image to the panoply of Trotsky's Bolshevism grows out of this context, in which revolution is the ghost in history's infernal machine. New section. Trotsky's early tasks. Marx ascribed a revolutionary vocation to the proletariat already in his early writings. Capital, the book, then took over from the Communist Manifesto the presupposition of a revolutionary working class compelled to burst bourgeois social relations asunder. This proletarian mythology was to become the theoretical common sense of turn-of-the-century socialism. Kautsky, the Pope of German socialism, described the Social Democrats as revolutionary but not revolution making. That's interesting. Revolutions made themselves. Only the revisionist Bernstein was sufficiently candid to recognize in this belief what he was to call, quote, Calvinism without God, end quote. For Trotsky in this period, God was the masses, not the party. Trotsky shared with Marx the view which Zorel explained as a political mythology of catastrophic revolution. Lenin, by comparison, was the broker of the revolution. Trotsky's biography was, among other things, the transition from one to the other. In Our Political Tasks, Trotsky pilloried Lenin for his mechanistic view of politics. In One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, Lenin had rendered politics as organization. Socialism for Trotsky was an irreversible molecular process which ran deep through the current of modern history, an elemental nature-like force which made organizational politics an unwitting farce conducted over it. The ant-like activity of the organizational work would in Trotsky's eyes be washed away by the spring torrents of history. The historic inevitability of socialism was simultaneously a process of political self-determination of the proletariat. For the young, unlike the later Trotsky, the present task was not party building or the conversion of the intelligentsia to Marxism, but rather the tapping and cultivating of this already existing and developing process of proletarian hegemony. Not the vanguard party, but the mass party. The class as party was to be the center of socialist argument and agitation. Theory here was strictly secondary, rather than primary. Sectarian body battles among the intelligentsia missed the point that a theory of political development would not replace a politically developing proletariat itself. The politics of Lenin's paper, Iskra, were wasted precisely because they elevated conversion of the intelligence over other practices. then necessarily endorsing the empirical consciousness of the proletariat in paternalistic manner. Iskra was obsessed with the press and the program rather than with proletarian self-activity. Iskra's politics were formalistic rather than substantive, incidental more than fundamental. Against this position, Trotsky held that of his, quote, dear teacher, and, quote, Axelrod. Unlike Lenin, Axelrod was no empty windbag or self-seeking aspirant to the role of Robespierre. Axelrod was a genuine proletarian ideologue in the sense that were only to be found in Germany. Axelrod did not speak with the intelligentsia only about the intelligentsia. For Axelrod, the intelligentsia was not the audience, the object of persuasion, but one political force among others. For the young Trotsky, intellectuals were the auxiliary to the working class and to history. The party was merely the consciousness and will of the organized class. As Marx and Engels had put it in the manifesto, the party was no more than the most enlightened section of the class. It saw further, but it was of the class, not superior to the class. As in the young Gramsci, so in the young Trotsky was the party an educator, not an administrator. The party based itself on the given level of consciousness of the proletariat and sought simply to raise it. The proletariat was to be the subject of policy, not only policy's object. The proletariat was not only to be a political audience, but also a, quote, collective actor, end quote. As in Luxembourg, the center of politics was the development of the conscious and autonomous activity of the proletariat. The failure to encourage and to enlighten this activity led, meanwhile, to substitutionism on the part of Lenin. Quote, substitutionism, always substitutionism, end quote. This was the motif of frenzied party building conducted in isolation from such cultivation. The Bolsheviks viewed themselves as the brain of the slumbering proletarian giant, which for Trotsky had motivating powers of its own and needed rather to be wakened than to be led. Trotsky acknowledged in our political tasks that his politics would likely be seen as syndicalist, for the logic of his case was workers' autonomy. The prospect did not seem much to bother him. Bolshevism, after all, was hopeless. So was liberalism, for the Russian bourgeoisie was insufficiently muscular to take the Russian bourgeoisie's place on the stage. Class politics, and not the abstract rights of man and citizen, was in any case the watchword. Here again Trotsky revealed his substantial affinity with Marx. Citizenship was, unfortunately, a value which received short shift in their hands. Against Lenin, but with Marx, Trotsky poured scorn on the idea that the division of labor was a central principle of socialist politics. The problem was to make society anew, not to replicate society's already existing and limiting forms. Trotsky effectively argued against the reduction of praxis to techne, which critical Marxists later proclaimed a hallmark of Bolshevism. See, for example, Habermas and Lubash. Lubash. One second. I want to see who this Lubash is. One second. Looks like it's Heinz Lubash. Just looks like Heinz Lubasch was a historian of some kind. I don't really see anything like extensive about him. Okay. Politics was not technique. Politics was not administration. Politics was education. The division of labor so deeply admired by Lenin perpetuated all these problems inherited from bourgeois society. Bolshevism was a philosophy of disastrous consequences for party life, as Bolshevism cultivated in the empty specialization. The craftsman, the whole person, and not the dissected modern detail worker, was rather the model appropriate for the party member and proletarian. I want to repeat that. That's a very, very good question. Good sentence. The craftsman, the whole person, not the dissected modern detail worker, was rather the model appropriate for the party member and proletarian. Lenin wanted the party to be a machine. Trotsky wrote its individual members cogs. Trotsky summoned against Lenin Marx's blistering criticism in Capital of the capitalist division of labor, which reduced individuals to exactly such cogs. In parallel to the strategy of Capital, Trotsky argued, the Bolshevik project separated mental from manual labor, expropriating conception and leaving only execution. Labor was left a helpless, brainless hulk. The Bolshevik party, like Capital, itself sucked up the human attributes of labor. Conscious activity was separated from executive activity, social democratic thinking from the technical means of social democratic thinking's application. ... Socialism from revolution. Without an adequate educational project, the party would at best reproduce the division between leaders and led, rather than begin to overcome it. The party could not be allowed to go this way. It could not be a, quote, huge factory, end quote, or a barracks, as Lenin desired. Everyday life educated the proletariat, not the discipline of the factory or the self-appointed Führer of socialism. The real aim of socialism was to transcend these. So I want to copy that paragraph down. With Lenin, the organizing head, the professional party itself set about removing lesser, merely empirical heads. Lenin had now implicitly and explicitly embraced Jacobinism. The barrister Bolshevik decreed that those who would rebel against him were bad, but his own rebellion was good. His enthusiasm for Jacobinism showed Lenin again to be a bourgeois thinker. Just as he shared with Capital a factory-enthused view of the world, so he espoused the politics of bourgeois self-emancipation, which corresponded with the apogee of the French Revolution. In theory, the appeal to the rights of abstract man and citizen, in practice, the guillotine. Trotsky unfortunately imagined the relation between the theory and practice to be necessary. The real problem was that the guillotine was presumed to be the appropriate means of pursuing abstract, quote, virtue. For Lenin, as for Robespierre, all the crevices of society were then to yield intriguers, hypocrites, aristocrats, and worst of all, moderates. In this, humanity divided itself into two parts, the good and the bad citizens. Suspicion became the means of establishing the difference. Jacobinism for Trotsky thus became manifest as a profoundly negative form of politics, whereas social democracy was by comparison the most optimistic of parties, because social democracy alone heard and responded to the riddle of history. The Jacobins, by contrast, endeavored to behead the class movement. Liquidation stood in for education, and Marx's Lenin head would have been the first to roll under Maximilian Lenin's rule. I like how this guy writes, man. Some people probably don't like this, but I like his his fucking Peter Beilharz vibes. Good. Sorry, my computer's being a fucking penis today. Oh my god. Sorry, I wait. There we are. Alright, we're back. Sorry, I thought I was going to fucking reboot my computer. Trotsky's pamphlet was, for all his disdain, addressed to the intelligentsia rather than to the masses. Trotsky's pamphlet's turgid prose and lambast had little evident effect. Our political task was later to become a bludgeon with which the Soviet prosecutor Vyshinsky would ruthlessly beat Trotsky in the 30s in the Moscow show trials. For Trotsky was eventually to become so obsessively identified with Lenin in his own mind that these juvenile bars were to re-emerge as an embarrassment, and they have been treated as such ever since by followers who, on his own advice, identified Trotsky and Lenin both as men of October. Yet as historians since Deutscher have observed, the young Trotsky showed acute sensitivity in his critique of nascent Stalinism. Come the fuck on. More than Deutscher and other sympathizers would allow, Trotsky also laid here the basis of the radical critique of Bolshevism as a necessarily authoritarian, compulsory, and compulsive aberration from socialism's libertarian impulse. In this sense, Our Political Task anticipated Trotsky's own biographical path into the politics of Jacobinism. In 1904, the young Trotsky, the oppositionist, the quote, syndicalist, end quote, had already unwittingly anticipated the path of the Russian Revolution. The difference was that, in its decisive act, he would stand not apart from Lenin, but together with Lenin in pride and defiance, sans jus to his Robespierre. New section, dress rehearsal. Between 1904 and 1917 stood 1905. Trotsky was later to baptize the 1905 Soviet the dress rehearsal, the major prologue to the October Revolution which followed it. Trotsky read history backwards, for the substance of 1905 was far more consonant with the democratic or at least libertarian temper of Trotsky's politics and Our Political Tasks. His own analysis of the events published as 1905 also announced his talent as historian, more particularly historical sociologist and political historian. In 1905, the book, Trotsky argued, in anticipation of much more recent attempts to explain the Russian enigma, that the history of Russia was an unbroken chain of heroic efforts to provide the military organization with continuity. He now developed his case for Russia as the paradigm case of uneven development. Trotsky's Russia was simultaneously the acme of highly concentrated capitalist development and the accretion of centuries of backward misery, the forced combination of American technology and czarist forms, primeval barbarism welded to urban modernism. Russia's own cities had commercial and administrative, and not manufacturing or productive histories. Liberalism had failed to prosper in the absence of the guild structure of Europe. As a result, the bourgeois intelligentsia was retarded, civil society weighed down under feudal tradition, a hothouse culture for economic development coexisted uneasily with archaic local political forms and customs. Here lay the genesis of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, already foreshadowed in the piece Our Political Tasks. Revolution was on the agenda, but not at the behest of a spineless bourgeoisie. Consequently, the proletariat would take its place at the helm of history, and by the logic of perpetual motion be obliged to open a revolutionary process, which would conclude only in the establishment of world socialism. The ghost of Marx haunts these pages too. Trotsky did not write literary political history in the manner of Marx's 18th Brumaire. Trotsky's prose is more sober and constrained. But like Marx, Trotsky views revolution as enchantment, and Trotsky employs some of the metaphorical modes of presentation so well deployed by Marx in his historical writings. Trotsky's view of the historical process in 1905, the book, is, in a sense, the Communist Manifesto's thesis telescoped and universalized. As European capital beats down customs barriers and Chinese walls, so does European capital plant there the basis of revolutionary development, which can no longer be bourgeois in form. Industrialization on a world scale is a necessary process, but it can no longer be initiated or at least controlled by capitalists. Capitalists were truly the sorcerer's apprentices. For Trotsky, the first to industrialize would be the last to achieve socialism, as the last would be first. The mole of history was bound to surface, blinking but alive and enthusiastic, in the East rather than in the West. Trotsky's historical sociology thus set the stage upon which the play of political history unfolds. Actors are hypnotized, somnambulists. Actors represent the mountainous forces of classes, but actors bear the individual attributes of Gapon, of Witt, and Yanovsky. In keeping up with the elemental teleology established in Our Political Tasks, individuals are less themselves than the forces which they personify. The problem of the role of the individual in history perpetually plagued Trotsky's historiography. The tension between particular and general now reappears. Marx had taught in Capital that individuals were bearers of their class character masks, obliged to follow the structural imperatives of capital or labor. In his historical writings, Marx had portrayed great individuals such as Bonaparte as mediators between historic classes. The consensus in the Second International was elaborated by Plekhanov, for whom individuals could only represent classes or epochs. The message was clear. If socialism was inevitable, individuals could only be socialism's historic agents or enemies. Individuals could not be socialism's active initiators, for such initiation was without purpose or reason. Trotsky himself rarely took such an absolutely determinist view, but given Trotsky's predilection to see elemental forces in history as themselves moving events, the role of individuals in his construction of history was somewhat compromised. This problem remained for Trotsky because, unlike Plekhanov or Kautsky, or imaginably Marx, he did not accept that the failure of socialism to emerge autogenetically was the end of the story. Trotsky's view, like Lenin's, ultimately refused this outcome. If history did not move history's self, history could be pushed, as history plainly was in October 1917, and pushed hard, if not far. In 1905, however, the book, it was the Soviet and not the party which was the major actor. In the young Trotsky's writing, the party is almost invisible. As the proletariat acted collectively, for the young Trotsky, so did the Soviet. The Workers' Council of Self-Management was a qualitatively new non-party organization working through the production process, but not restricted to the production process. The general strike was pervasive. The socialist movement was given its cue. The Russian journalists of socialism, who had for years lived like moles, now knew something of open skies, fresh air, and the free word. Their weapon was the word, and the revolutionary word was in the open. The pen was in his element. Trotsky was a leader without being a Jacobin. In 1905, the year 1905, revolution was, as Trotsky so passionately hoped, a learning experience for the Russian workers. The tedium of everyday life ruptured, the horizons of possibility lifted, a tremendous mysterious process took place, and amidst this chaos there arose the need for a new order. Again, Trotsky's history is reminiscent of Gramsci's view of the Biennio Rosso in Italy, as it is evocative of Orwell's sense of the new nascent Spanish order in Homage to Catalonia. Here were workers seeking dignity in chaos, seeking control of lives previously enshadowed, baking the city's bread, printing their own views and not those of others, behaving not as cogs in any machine, but as more complete individual personalities, representing the dawn of a new collective era for mankind. Trotsky portrayed the Soviet as phantasmagorical because, in part, it was. Trotsky tells, for example, of a blind and illiterate war veteran who, covered with crosses and decorations, complained of dire poverty and begged the Soviet to, quote, put a bit of pressure on number one, and, quote, the Tsar. While the Soviet was conspicuously less than all-powerful, the point was that the Soviet had acted as a counterpower. The Soviet was really a workers' government in embryo. The Soviet had taken on practical responsibility for matters of state, so that the blind war veteran was simply addressing his needs to what seemed to him to be the real alternative seat of power. As Trotsky understood, the general strike strategy rendered the existing state power obsolete. This meant that the strike, or the Soviet, was obliged to assume state functions. It ran the railways and the postal and telegraphic services. It intervened authoritatively in economic disputes. Above all, it formalized direct democracy through new organs of power, the councils themselves. Although private property and the state bureaucracy remained intact, the actual running of the national means of production and commerce lay in the hands of the Soviets. Through the use of the political strike, the proletarian masses not only stated their opposition to the status quo, but also their positive claims to autonomy. This was exactly, in Trotsky's eyes, the educative process of socialist revolution in nous. For every such strike gave rise to a whole series of new facts, both material and moral, which set in train open-ended processes of confirmation and radical enlightenment. The formal defeat of the Soviet amounted to little, for a great deal had been learned about the fragility of Tsarism, the tenuousness of capitalist relations, and about the power of proletarian self-activity. The mass here was really everything, the party the mere crest of its massive tidal movement. In all this, Trotsky ran a line between revolutionary politics and reformism, between Bolshevism and Menshevism. Bolshevism Trotsky had already dispatched in our political tasks. Menshevism now revealed itself to be even more hapless. 1 second. Sorry, my computer's being a dick. For the ever-loving God, please sort this piece of shit out. Send it to hell. Okay. Where am I? Menshevism now revealed Menshevism self to be even more hapless, wedded to mechanical recipes, quote, first the bourgeoisie, then us, end quote, searching in vain with magnifying glasses in hand for the non-existent sans-culotte to get the business into conformity with the pattern set in France after 1789. While the Bolsheviks sought to be the head to the corpus of the workers' movement, the Mensheviks instead took to their beds. They would not budge until history had was properly repeated. Neither could accept that the next phase was to be dominated by the proletariat. Trotsky and Parvus alone saw this as necessary, and Trotsky alone viewed this as an active transitional rather than a parliamentary interim regime. More, the Russian Revolution would be the prologue to world socialist revolution. Trotsky here ventured more of the theory of permanent revolution with which his name was to become so closely identified. Henceforth, the proletariat would be unable to contain itself within bourgeois political forms or bourgeois nation-states. Socialist revolution would grow over uncontrollably from bourgeois to proletarian tasks and from individual nations across the entire world system. What was less clear to the young Trotsky was whether this envisaged process was actually necessary or simply possible. Trotsky's youthful historiography was informed by a nice sense of specificity and contingency, yet the process under analysis was also granted a causal inevitability and a determining power. Revolution, Trotsky wrote, was the natural element of the Marxist politician, such as himself. Revolution came and went, crawled or leapt, and yet revolution's movement was also clearly inexorable. Trotsky simultaneously believed history to be an enormous machine working in the service of his ideals, moving slowly, barbarously, but moving, swallowing up his own life's blood as fuel, and still not devouring fast enough. History did, of course, finally swallow up Trotsky's last drop of blood, but not in the figurative sense which Trotsky now entertained. The young Trotsky evidently believed that history was a teleological source which chose history's instruments at will and drove history's mission home. Trotsky was, however, equally committed to will, organization, education, enlightenment, and moral development as the human motivations of socialism. Trotsky was the apparently impossible humanist and determinist at the same time. Contrary to Trotsky's Bolshevik disciples, however, it should never be denied that Trotsky's humanism was there. Indeed, Trotsky's humanism was the major stream in the social and political thought of the young Trotsky. New section, Revolution and Permanence. By 1905, the year, Trotsky had staked a claim to revolutionary authority in his own right. Perched between Bolshevism and Menshevism, a major actor in the events of the Soviet, Trotsky was no longer Axelrod's quibbling if correct student, but was now a historic personality himself. In 1906, Trotsky penned a retrospective on these shifts and developments. It was entitled Results and Prospects. In it, Trotsky explained more of his developing theory of permanent revolution, which was subsequently to receive its final explication in the Permanent Revolution of 1903. Results and Prospects commences from the premise that the Russian Revolution, now an actual fact, was the inevitable result of the contradiction between capitalist development and the forces of ossified absolutism. No bourgeois stepped forward to bear this cause, thankfully for Trotsky, because the very idea of resorting to analogy with 1789 or 1848 was anathema. Trotsky agreed with Parvis that the essential difference between these revolutions was that there was in Russia no craft or guild class to become hegemonic and thrust itself into power. Capitalism in Russia did not, in fact, result from the developments of the handicraft system. Absolutism had rather assisted in fettering the country with the shackles of capitalism, which it could not itself restrain. The Russian way was new. Trotsky again resisted the proposal that Jacobinism ought to provide the model for socialist politics in Russia, but this time Trotsky's criticism was muted. Jacobinism was not our way, but Jacobinism had to be defended against the calumnies and stupid vituperations of anemic, phlegmatic liberalism. Plainly, Trotsky's vitriol was to be directed outward in future. Heroic Jacobinism Trotsky now viewed as something of an inspiration. The shadow of the guillotine had somehow receded. Not that Jacobinism became a model, for Jacobinism never did in Trotsky's self-understanding. Lenin was the only Bolshevik proudly to proclaim Jacobinism his lineage. For Trotsky, socialism did not rest on compulsion, on forcing individuals or history. Socialism remained the élan vital, the evolutionary motor of everyday life, and paradoxically of capitalist development itself. The growth of industry, the growth of large entrepreneurs, the growth of towns, the growth of the proletariat in general, and the industrial proletariat in particular, all prepared the way not only for struggle, but also for victory. The Russian Revolution could only initiate this process. Without direct state support of the European proletariat, the working class could not remain in power and convert its temporary domination into a lasting socialist dictatorship. This much was already clear to Trotsky in 1906. The historical scenario seemed still to alternate in his mind. Necessity, possibility, ... The proletariat obliged to behave thus and thus. Revolution to be necessarily socialist and international, but only possibly ... Now Trotsky was agreeing with Kautsky that inevitably dissolved into possibility. now slipping into the language of probability and finally inevitability. As Trotsky had asserted in his autobiography, necessity always captured contingency in Trotsky's mental processes. By 1906, the transition from possibility to inevitability seemed almost complete. The revolution in the East would now infect the Western proletariat with a revolutionary idealism and rouse in it a desire to speak to their enemies, quote, in Russian. Mass parties like the German Social Democrats would likely become obstacles to socialist revolution. The German revolutionaries were Philistine schoolmasters, prognosticators. Trotsky had yet to make his pact with Bolshevism against these timid, ridiculous time-wasters. Another decade opening the Great War was to pass before Trotsky embraced Lenin, but the basis for their later partnership had been laid. When the party eventually knocked at the door, Kautsky may have been in his slippers, but Trotsky was dressed and waiting. He had always resisted the temptation to burst through open doors. When history, capital H history, beckoned, Trotsky was finally to concede that the proletarian self-activity was not enough. Unlike Kautsky, Martov, or Plekhanov, Trotsky had been awaiting the revolution in the hope that it would really come. New section. Conclusions. Trotsky had always dreamed of being a writer. State power had not been Trotsky's lifelong hope or vocation, but when the moment came, Trotsky happily left behind the pacific realm of his prisons, his study in Vienna, and enthusiastically entered the laboratory of Soviet socialism and Soviet man. There would now be no time for thinking, as he himself recognized. The word had given way to the deed. Everything now seemed possible. In the rush to practice, Trotsky left judgment behind. Now having awaited, and then run with capital H history, Trotsky could only blame it when things turned out bad, initiating the later hackneyed claims that it was adverse historical circumstances alone which were responsible for the strangling of proletarian democracy. The teleology of capital H history here overpowers Trotsky's early hopes for social democracy. But there is no point in waiting for democracy. It has to be worked upon, particular towards the general. Politics may involve more than education, but in both there remains a great deal of learning. The end. Thank you for listening.